Hello, in this lesson, we're going to be installing WeaveNet. We are going to be installing WeaveNet in our cluster, but once we've installed WeaveNet, we want to make sure that our network is fully working. So we're actually going to spend a little bit of time testing our network and making sure everything works as expected once we have set up our WeaveNet networking plugin. So the first thing I need to do is I need to log in to my two worker nodes, and I need to turn on IP forwarding on both nodes. So I'm going to use these two public IP addresses to get logged into my two worker nodes. So I've pulled them both up side by side just so that you can see what I'm doing. And I'm going to enter this command simultaneously for both servers. So just know that this command does need to be run on both worker servers. So I'm just going to do a sudo sysctl, and the value that I'm going to set is net.ipv4.conf.all.forwarding. And I'm going to set that value equal to 1 to turn on IP forwarding. Now I need to set that value permanently. When I run that sysctl command, that only sets the value until the next restart of the server. So if we restart one of our servers, that value will no longer be set and our networking won't work anymore. So to make that permanent, I need to also set that value in sysctl.conf. So I'm going to do an echo, and I'm going to echo net.ipv4.conf.all.forwarding. And I'm going to set that equal to 1. And I need to echo that string to the sysctl.conf file. So I'm going to pipe that value, and I'm going to do a sudo t-a to append that value to etc/sysctl.conf. So now I have enabled IP forwarding on both of my worker nodes, and I've made sure that that setting is still going to be set if I restart either one of my servers. And now I'm done working with my worker node, so I can actually go ahead and close this terminal window. So I'm going to come over here and I'm going to start using kubectl. Now, there's a couple different ways we can use kubectl at this point. You can always log into one of your controller servers and just use kubectl from there. But you may remember earlier, I showed you how we can use kubectl locally, and that's what I'm going to do in this lesson. So just a reminder, in order to do that, I need to set up an SSH tunnel to get around some of the networking limitations of the cloud servers. So I'm going to set up a tunnel with an SSH-L. And for my configuration, I'll put 6443:localhost:6443. So we're going to open up a tunnel from my local machine to 6443 on the remote machine, which in this case is going to be my Kubernetes API load balancer. So I need to enter my credentials and specify what server I'm connecting to. So I'm going to put user at, and then I'll just copy this public IP for my load balancer cloud server. And I'll paste that in here. And now that I'm logged in, I'm just going to leave this session open. And as long as this session is open, that SSH tunnel will remain active. So I can go over to a separate terminal and I can run kubectl commands against my cluster. So I just did a kubectl get nodes to test my kubectl setup and make sure that I can connect to the cluster appropriately. So I'm able to connect to my cluster and I'm ready to go ahead and start the process of installing WeaveNet. So I'm going to install WeaveNet with this command. And this is just a kubectl apply-f, and Weaveworks provides this service that allows us to get a customized install script for WeaveNet. So we're passing in our Kubernetes version, and we're just using kubectl to dynamically get that version. And then we're passing in an IP range, which is actually our cluster CIDR. So in order for WeaveNet to be configured appropriately, we have to provide that value. So we're just providing our cluster CIDR of 10.200.0.0/16. So I'm going to run that command, and that's going to create several objects to install WeaveNet in my cluster. And now that all those objects are created, I'm finished installing WeaveNet. So what I need to do next is I need to make sure that my networking is actually up and running. So I'm going to test a few things just to make sure that everything is okay. First, I'm going to do a kubectl get pods -in cube-system. That's going to list out the pods in the cube system namespace. And the ones I'm looking for are these two WeaveNet pods. And all I'm really doing is I'm just making sure that these pods started up correctly. So I'm making sure that all the containers are ready. They both say 2 out of 2, and they're both in the running status. So it looks like my WeaveNet pods stood up correctly. So the next step is to actually run some tests to make sure that networking is functioning appropriately. So what we're going to do in order to test our networking is we're actually going to set up some pods, and we're going to set up a service. What we want to test is we want to test that a pod can connect to another pod, including pods that are running on different worker nodes. And we also want to test that pods can connect to services. So what we'll do is we will stand up 2 pods. That way we'll get 1 on each worker node, and we'll stand up a service for those 2 pods. Then we will stand up a 3rd pod, and we'll run some tests to make sure that that 3rd pod can connect to the other 2 pods, and that that 3rd pod can also connect to the service. So the first step is to set up our 2 test pods, and we're just going to set up some Nginx pods that are just going to run a basic Nginx server that we can connect to over HTTP. So I'm going to go ahead and run this command, and if you're following along, feel free to copy it from the description below the video. And all I'm doing is a kubectl apply, and here's the contents of the file that I'm applying. And I'm just spinning up a deployment of an Nginx image with 2 replicas. So that's how I'm going to get my 2 Nginx pods. So if I do a kubectl get pods, I should see my 2 Nginx pods, and it looks like they're both in the process of spinning up. Now I also need to create a service because we want to test that we can connect to services. And I can just do that with a kubectl expose, and I'm going to expose this deployment that I just created. So kubectl expose deployment/nginx, that command will create a service that exposes this deployment. So it'll automatically be tied to the pods from that deployment. So I've created my service and I've created my pods. Now I need to spin up a 3rd pod that I'm going to use to test from. So we're going to check this 3rd pod to make sure that it can connect to all the other pods and services that we just set up. And I can do that with this kubectl run busybox command. This is going to be a busybox pod. Busybox is just a very small, lightweight, basic image that can be used for testing. We're using the radial/busybox plus image with the curl tag because the default busybox does not come with curl. It's so lightweight that it doesn't even have curl. We want to use curl to connect to our Nginx pods. So this is just a lightweight busybox that is that basic busybox image with curl added on so we can use curl. So now I've gone ahead and run my busybox pod. Now I'm going to run another command that's going to create this environment variable called pod name. And all that's doing is it's going to get the name of my busybox pod, and it's going to set that to this variable. Because if I do a kubectl get pods, you can see that my busybox pod has this long name. I don't want to have to type that out every time. I don't want to copy and paste it. So I'm just going to reference this environment variable just to make things go a little bit faster as I'm running the rest of these commands. So now I've done all that setup, and it's time to actually test whether our busybox pod can connect to the other pods and the service that we created. So first, let's make sure it can connect directly to each one of the Nginx pods. In order to do that, I need to get the IP addresses of both of those pods. So one way to get those IP addresses is to do a kubectl get EP Nginx. And what that does is it gets the endpoints, EP stands for endpoints, of my Nginx service. And the endpoints of my Nginx service is actually the 2 IP addresses of my 2 Nginx pods. There's other ways to get those IP addresses. This is just one of those ways. So that's the IP address of one, and that's going to be the IP address of the other. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to run a command inside the busybox pod to make sure it can connect to both of those other pods. And I can do that with a kubectl exec. And because we set up that pod name environment variable, I can reference that in order to run the command inside my busybox pod. and I'll put a dash dash. Now I can enter the command that I want to run. I'm just going to do a curl, and then I'm going to copy this first endpoint IP address. I don't need to include the port 80 because 80 is the default. And here's the response that I got from that curl command. As you can see, this response is some HTML. You can see the header right there says welcome to Nginx. There's the title. It says welcome to Nginx. So that's an HTML response from the Nginx server that is running on the other pod. And because we have two pods and they're both going to be running on different nodes, by connecting to both these pods, we're testing that we can connect to a pod on the same node, and we're also testing that we can connect to a pod on a different node. So I'm going to go ahead and copy that second IP address so we can connect to pod number 2. And I'll just repeat that kubectl exec command, but I'm going to put in that second IP address this time. And we should get the same response. And sure enough, there's our response, the same HTML response, but this time coming from a different pod. So we can successfully connect to pods. It looks like that part of our networking is set up correctly, and pods can communicate with each other. Now we need to verify that we can connect to services. So I need to get the IP address of my Nginx service that I created. So I'm going to do a kubectl get svc. And of course, there's my Nginx service that we created earlier. And that IP address right now for me is 10.32.0.188. So I'm going to copy that IP address, and I'm going to run that kubectl exec command one more time with a curl. And this time I'll put in the IP address of the service, and I should get that HTML response yet again. And sure enough, there it is, my HTML welcome to Nginx. So I've now confirmed that pods can talk to other pods, whether they're on the same worker node or whether they're on a different worker node. And I've confirmed that pods can talk to services. It looks like my Kubernetes networking is set up correctly and everything is working as expected.